Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance by voices within the independent Catholic movement. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. And now, meet your hosts, Reverend Dr. Trish Sullivan-Bonney and Reverend Dr. Jayme Matthias.
Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. I'm Father Jayme Matthias.
And I am Reverend Trish Sullivan-Bonney.
And we are excited in this episode to welcome a special guest, Reverend Trish.
Well, I'm really touched and delighted to introduce all of those friends of ours who watch this podcast, as well as those who are getting to know us. My friend and colleague, T. Michael Rock, who is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ for, decades now. Should I out you by saying 3 decades, 4 decades, something like that? There's a saying in the 12-step movement, how do you get time? You don't drink and you don't die. It's kind of like that in ministry too. So anyway, I have known T. Michael for many years through his work with men and a spirituality group, but I also know him because he's been such a wonderful leader in the Twin Cities around issues of justice and social transformation. He's on the faculty of the United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, which trains a lot of amazing progressive ministers for our region. A lot of folks who go into the UCC, but a lot of folks who end up in other denominations like the Episcopal Church. And his work is just fabulous in the way he shepherds and shapes clergy in development. So, T. Michael, I'm really happy you're here. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here.
Do you have anything you would want to add about, how did I do with your bio? I didn't even look on your website. I just tried to do it by memory. Did I forget anything auspicious?
Sure, you did fine.
Good. Well, I thought of you, T. Michael, because, we're coming, we're in the thick of the Christmas season, but it's not just an everyday Christmas season for the culture or for our faith communities that we're trying to lead. It's a Christmas season that for clergy is, as always, very busy and laden with all kinds of special this and special that and meetings and events. But it's happening in the midst of some pretty drastic cultural upheaval. Many of us would name it as pretty horrifying. You and I are both in the Twin Cities. I'm in this the city with the second largest Somali community in the United States, and some of whom are, cherished friends. And what's happening here with people being grabbed, whether they're Latino or Somali, has been pretty grave and pretty distressing to a lot of folks. So I thought of this question of how do we stay centered and sane and healthy in our ministry when lots of stuff is going on, both normally, the normal crazy busy, but it's complicated by what we're dealing with in our, towns and cities. So I was thinking we could kick off with one question. You have many years of pastoral ministry experience dealing with the ins and outs of the holidays and other times, and this is not the first time life has been difficult. I know it's pretty awful now. Rumor has it the Black Death wasn't much fun either, but it's just a particularly pointed time for a lot of us. What would you say about, what for you, when you think about it, makes the holiday season particularly challenging for ministers, whether that's emotionally or spiritually or professionally? What could you share with us about what you've noticed and what you think about as you're shaping and training new ministers?
Thanks, Trish and Jayme. It's great to be with you. It's just a gift to really slow down and remind ourselves that we need to do self-care along the way. I have been saying to myself and other colleagues for a long time that ministers don't work necessarily harder during this time of year, but the musicians work really hard. So that it's the peripheral sometimes. But I think what we do that is intense during this time is tend to people's stories, because holidays bring up the sometimes the greatest joy, but also the deepest grief. This movement towards the shadow, the darkness, and solstice was is part of the cycle of living and dying, and so the folks who've experienced loss over the year, those losses come back to us in very, very tangible ways during these years. We do family rituals around, taking that ornament out of the box that, is from a deceased relative, and kind of holding that space and remembering ancestors. And it's just a deep knowing during this time of year. And I think we find that in those shadow places, in the deepening shadows of the time of year changing. And that happens more so in Minnesota up here in the north. The shadows get really, really long. During this time of year. But yeah, it's just really gifted by that ancestor memory as well as the sorrow it brings. And as you say, in the caring of our community right now, the Somali community, the Latinx community, um, the rapid responders who are showing up every day. A lot of folks are trained to follow these ICE vehicles and show up as community support and recorders, and um, is holy work. And so one of the things that I did last night was we have a rapid responder vigil every night during this time. And then we're going to have a in-person and Zoom one for families affected by deportation. And so we gather together as colleagues in this work, in these rapid responder kind of moments. And it is hard work. People don't show up on screen like we are with their cameras and smiles, but they're kind of got camera off, but they're engaged during chat. And I think they're singing along when we sing. And it's really important for us to gather and to bless each other and to acknowledge that this work is hard. And it has a separate layer right now in the midst of all that we're dealing with. So, yeah, there's lots going on, and but we do it together. We're not alone.
Team Michael, what a delight to have you with us. And now, as we approach the holiday season, I know especially for those of us who approach it as clergy, it has one meaning and or set of activity for us. For those outside of our ministries, is there any way that you might pull back the curtain and maybe help our friends to understand what is it like for clergy as they approach the holidays? And is there anything that we might learn from that? I'm imagining that in some ways, it may be difficult to understand what it is that clergy are going through. What might lay people know about the whole experience of clergy during the holiday season?
Uh, yeah, I think depending on the cycles of things, I'm actually in a new church setting right now. I was just installed actually just a few months ago, and so I'm learning new traditions of a new community, which is both freeing in some ways and daunting in others, because it feels like a lot of catch up as far as what each community has as their traditions during the season. Um, but yeah, I think it's the pastoral care piece that is most intense. The story is not a new story. I mean, the lessons and carols are the lessons and carols for the season. We're not surprised necessarily at the birth, but to allow a message, to craft a message, to kind of partner with the Spirit to create hope in the season is very real. And I hope that all the preachers and pastors are confronted every year by the prophet message from John the Baptist, that they're confronted by the post-exilic Isaiah, in the vision, for what happens when a lion lies down with a lamb and the child plays over the hole of the adder's den and all that stuff. And that confrontation is deep in the church. And to make that real over and over again for thousands of years is kind of the challenge for clergy. But it's not a new challenge. We should be prepared for it, hopefully. And I am a musical person, so I hear the John the Baptist "Prepare ye the way of the Lord" in my head all the time during this season, because that's what we're called to do during this season is to help prepare this way, and to confront empire, to do all the challenging things, and to do self-care and pastoral care along the way. So that's what makes it busy, but there's also just beautiful times of grace. I make it a point to go sing carols at nursing homes and homeless encampments and wherever I'm called to be. And those are very gentle spiritual times to just pause and remember through song and prayer that we are in this together.
When you were describing staying present to the shadow of the season, the darkness. I
Mhm.
think one of the interesting things that's kind of in the foreground for me as a pastor and a preacher right now is that I too have been guilty of sort of sanitizing the season, you know, keeping it very upbeat, and preaching in a way that, because in the culture we sort of sanitize the season, right? So it's all
Mhm.
about, oh, this beautiful the crash and oh, the shepherds, and they're so pastoral out there. And we've totally erased from the story, a lot of us, I think some of us more than others. It's certainly something I've been trying to recover, how marginal everyone in this story is. Everyone in the story is marginal. Mary and Joseph are only getting counted so that they can be taxed. They have no social standing. They end up in a stable. The shepherds were like pariahs in their culture. They are the ones that get the first, announcement. I mean, there's so many people in this story that are actually people we're seeing right around us now. And so I've been really thinking myself about like what is that tension in shepherding my community about hope and fear, that there's so much fear afoot. And yet, the story actually creates a lens for us to see the contemporary people in a really fresh and beautiful way. The migrants, they left and went to Egypt. They had to flee their country. Well, a lot of the people who are here illegally had to flee. They came up because there was no way they could stay where they were. They were threatened. There was no opportunity. There was lack of food. I mean, whatever drove them to walk thousands of miles, some of them with children in their arms. I mean, this is the Christmas story we're living.
Right.
Um, but I do know like it is a tension for me between one of the things for me as a pastor is to continue to be the person who's holding out the hope even when I'm not feeling very hopeful. When I'm feeling, last week was a particularly tough week for me. I was out doing activism in a variety of settings, and then getting in front of the community, and then needing to remind myself that this is not the place for me to process my own personal experience, but to keep lifting up, the hope that people need to hear. And it's a tension for me. I don't know if you have any observations about that or not, or any suggestions for those of us who are trying to do stuff. How do we, keep ourselves, for lack of a better word, kind of hold it together for our communities, but at the same times, care for ourselves and not feel that self-care is like selfish or even unfaithful
Mhm.
because we're distressed.
Yeah,
I
that's a
went on
great
a long
question.
time there. Sorry
Yeah.
about that.
No, that's a great question, Trish. Yeah, it's a pretty intentional piece of when I teach worship class, worship in the church at the seminary, is we talk about that boundary. Like you can have the worst week, and if that leaks out into your leadership, you got to be really careful of how to do that. And it doesn't mean you need to be embodied, because we want pastors to be completely embodied in there and be honest about that, but to not ask the congregation to take care of them in that any given moment either. And so, I've officiated countless funerals and ones that really affected me deeply, and I've cried many times from pulpits, but not breaking down so much that people need to come out of the pews to take care of me, so having that way to process your own emotions and grief, and you can let your heart leak out your eyes all you want, that's fine. Because that's just real. It's we're in this because we love people and we love people. It means we're going to be emotional, hopefully, about that, and we're going to carry that grief in our bodies. But if we're doing the good care, whether it's spiritual direction or therapy or whatever it is along the way, all the more powerful to show up in community with our own grief and issues, because we all have them. And to deny them means we've got unresolved grief that's also coming out sideways. And so it is a delicate balance, but it's also a really, really important thing to do. And it's why that I do the daily vigils with the rapid responders, because that heals me to be in community. And I get a lot of church, as where we first met was in a centering prayer kind of environment. And I that's my community. That's my spiritual community, so that I can show up in a service that I'm leading in the parish that has integrity, because I've done my work, so I encourage all my students to have that spiritual director, have that prayer group, have that community of practice outside of their work. Because if they're processing their own faith journey in the midst of a Sunday morning, you're not serving the community, you're making it about you. And hopefully it's less about us than about these beautiful people gathered who are broken and beautiful at the same time. So.
T. Michael, I'm really struck by some of the words that you're using. For instance, you speak about balance, which we know comes from a Greek word root bis lanx, meaning two bowls or two plates. How it is that we have to balance various aspects of our life, especially within ministry and the church. How it is that we need to balance the pastoral care that we share with others, as you had suggested, with our own self-care. The image that comes to mind is the church's age-old active contemplative balance, which is almost, I like to compare it to respiration. How it is that we need to find moments where we can step back and breathe in God's spirit, and then that energizes us to go back out into ministry to God's people. We see that even in Jesus's life, how it was that he was out there ministering to folks, but then he would withdraw to the wilderness to pray and to recharge his spiritual batteries, if you will. Any thoughts on how it is, especially for clergy who carry their own stress, as you and Trish suggest, the grief, the anxiety, the anger of our communities, and that we feel in our own lives? How is it that we can do this in a healthy way, so that we don't find? I love how it is that you talk about, we need to be really careful about how it is that our communities are not affected by some of the things that affect us personally as ministers. Any wisdom or insight there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's everybody's got to find their spiritual practice, right? And for me, that has always kind of ebbed and flowed. As it's sometimes in my ministry career, I've been a journaler, and that's been really healing. I'll be writing poetry, before the services, just to kind of get some of my emotions processed so I can go in and lead people. But other people have different things, and a lot of it's embodied work. There are seasons of my life where it's much more about making sure I'm doing my self-care routine for this sack of bones. And that all that stuff is grounding work for doing ministry, and so taking care of ourselves whatever way we can helps us to be present for others. And we all practice ministry of presence. And we can't do that if our minds are so filled, and if our hearts are so filled, and if our bodies are so stressed. And so finding those outlets, finding those places of care and concern for ourselves is how we do it. And many, many, many of us, because we're this ministry thing calls all these kind of wild extroverted people out into the ministry, is to do it in relationship. So during the installation I just experienced in my new setting, I had 30 participants, and from all different faith and walks of life, and because I wanted to tell my community that I'm not in this alone. I am just one little cog in this beautiful spiritual machination of things. And we do this justice work and this pastoral work and this liturgical work together. Liturgy is the work of the people. And so we're inviting people always into that divine cycle of life and death. And so we're just really, I think ministry is such a blessing in so many ways when we are doing that self-care along the way. And
I
it's
think that it just seems especially important to you, Michael, because I think so many of us, you phrase it as a cog, and I just love that image because I think it's tempting for some of us to have a sort of Messiah complex, if you will. When you get into ministry and you roll up your sleeves and you see the deep, deep needs of people, there's just something about the human heart wanting to be able to respond to all of this, which makes self-care sometimes difficult. I know I've had conversations with our parish administrator here in Austin. Because there are times when I just need to step back a bit. There are times when I, for instance, just have to get a little space. And
Mhm.
she was telling people, Father's on vacation. I said, let's rephrase that to the people of God and let them know that I'm on retreat because these times are really important for us to be able to step back, to retreat a bit from ministry, and to be able to really use that time for self-care.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's such an important thing. Having that spiritual practice, having that retreat is really, really important. Uh, and yeah, and may do it on the regular. There's a survey done around interim ministry, and interim ministers are these gifted people that go into places after there's been a loss or a leaving of some sort. And they'll say that the healthy congregations were pastored by people who did self-care and continuing education and kept on growing and learning and exploring and had community around them. And the churches that are toxic and are really hard are places where the leadership was not doing that. They had gotten stuck in their ministry and were going through them kind of the everyday stuff and making light of Christmas, as Trish was saying, like we're not really being confronted by the stories of the marginalization. And those churches were really not healthy. And so I really believe in that. I take all my vacation time and retreat time and continuing ed time, and I always have, and I hope always to do that because it's good for me, and I think it's ultimately good for the people, and it's good modeling as well. So.
Well, I need to hear that, T. Michael, because I'm not good at that. I'm teaching at a local university and I'm pastoring this community and I'm a leader in my denomination and I'm involved with like some major activism that's going on in my city and around it. And I know so yesterday, like I just use myself as an example of what not to do, right? I started the day utterly, totally wiped and exhausted, psychically really wiped out. It had been a really tough week last week. And then, of course, yesterday, you're on. Oh, by the way, if you're wondering why I'm looking through these golden colored glasses, this is how my life is this lately. While we were talking, those of you who are listening, I am showing my glasses split in the middle over the bridge of the nose. This is kind of what my week has been like.
Wow.
And so, yesterday I was scrambling trying to get my grades in, and then I was getting everything ready for the Advent reconciliation service. And then I got a really disappointing phone call that a position I was really had my heart set on, I'm not even going to get an interview for. And I was just feeling crushed. And I went in to get ready to lead the reconciliation service, and no one showed up. And that's the kind of like that's Jayme was saying like what are our realities behind the scenes that lay people need to see is that like it's not just what goes on Sunday that can like really stretch us and strain us. And I know like one of the things I battle with, and I don't know if any of our other clergy will relate to this, but is like resentment. Like, you asked me to do X, Y, or Z, and then I did it, and then there was no participation or nobody got behind it. And I have to constantly work on that. And I don't work on it 99% of the time with people in my community.
Mhm.
I pick up the phone and I call trusted advisors. I have been in therapy all of my adult life. I will probably be in therapy until I die. I think everybody benefits from that kind of listening, and particularly those of us who are trying to not bring our own stuff forward, right? Call the women in my women's group, but it was a tough, tough day. It was a tough, tough day. And when I think about it, I don't take enough time to refill the well. I don't. And then I wonder why I'm dropping the bucket in and it's going clank at the bottom of when it hits the bottom, right? So, what kinds of things do you suggest for, your students, like when they're thinking about going out into this professional milieu, what do you suggest to them? Like, what would you say to me? Okay, forget them. Your friend Trish, only a few miles from you, what would you
Yeah.
tell her that she should be doing? Because I'm going to listen because a new year is a coming.
Well, I think all of our learning are from failures in these moments, right? I mean, that's where our greatest learning is where we've gone, oh, boy, I didn't hit the mark there, So, and I've been there, Trish. I totally been in that exhausted place and, super active and called into these different things at the Capitol and carrying so much stress that things just break around me, right? I have to go clean up this water mess I made as I brought this lamp over for this podcast because I, was rushing at the end. I mean, that's part of life, right? And one of the things I learned and committed to many years ago, because I was in that one of those seasons of high stress and not paying attention to my own retreating and my own personal work, is crafting the language of invitation. And so now for a decade or more, I don't go to the Capitol and protest and testify in committee hearings unless I take somebody with me. I always have a partner. And I don't plan a worship service by myself. I bring a group of people into that moment. So if it's just us there, there's two or three gathered. Because too many times I got caught in that same spot, and I didn't want to get resentment to kind of lead the day. So partnering in that work, in that language of invitation, like, let's share this ministry together has been a real healing piece in my own ministry and what I encourage, find your community of practice, uh, and and then maintain those relationships, right? Like do whatever you can to be in relationship with more and more people so that you have people to go with you to I showed up yesterday at the Carmel Mall where the ICE agents were basically broke a man's driver's side window and drug him out into the street and arrested him. And so it was right down the street from where I work. And so we went out there and we were several folks, but we knew we were together because it was part of that rapid responder network to kind of bring folks into community. And and it's a horrific thing to watch that kind of violence happen, that state sanctioned violence. And but we're doing it together does make a difference. And then afterwards, there's process and holding and crying and singing and hugging and we leave there grounded again for whatever happens next. And so I brought that with me into the rapid responder vigil last night. That I felt very grounded because of the work that we did before, during, and after that very, very stressful time. And so, and see the other piece, Trish, I know that you love as well is cultivating joy. So you gotta have times to celebrate and play and dance and I know you do that in your community. Is that there's a sense of joy when you walk in the door, and that cultivation really is part of that healing ministry. And when we're not doing it, it's hard to do joy by yourself, and so inviting others into that joy is really a special thing in both the chaplaincy world and the social activist world and the pastoral world. Cultivating joy has to happen along the way. And that was the song that undergirded my installation was justice and joy. Because if I'm not doing that, then I need to I need to be a shorter or cook somewhere. I can, make food for somebody, but ministry needs to have that balance.
Keep cultivating joy, Reverend Trish, right? T. Michael, the word that's on my heart right now is boundaries. When I hear the story, for instance, of that you tell of someone smashing in the window of another person and how it is that these responders are assisting in these moments. I mean, the smashing of a window is the crossing of a boundary. And I think that we as professionals all struggle with, these challenges with respect to boundaries. I know that for myself as a young priest, amid the clergy sexual abuse scandal of the Roman Catholic Church, that just really shaped my view of boundaries in ministry. And so I'm just wondering if you have any wisdom when it comes to boundaries, especially for those whom you teach and for clergy who are out in the Lord's vineyard, how it is that we might be able to um, continue to lift up and to really embrace and and esteem good boundaries in ministry and in our ministry to God's people.
Yeah, it's certainly essential. Absolutely. Uh, I go back to community all the time, relationship. My boundaries are maintained in my community, and I mean, I'm the one responsible for my boundaries, right? And uh, to expect other people or to expect some egalitarian kind of thing um, as a white-bodied male person, I have to create, a sense of humility and vulnerability in my own life to be able to be in relationship, authentic relationship with myself and with others. And so, yeah, boundaries are part of everything we do. And in all those places. And it's why it's so painful to watch boundaries not be there. For years, I served as a volunteer prison chaplain. I went into the prison every week and worked with these inmates, and it's why I'm kind of an abolitionist when it comes to the prison industrial complex, because the inhuman thing is you've taken away people's agency and self-determination in the prison system. And it's really hard to be spiritual in that space. And yet, God breaks through all the time. Spirit breaks through this inhuman experience and finds holy and finds joy. Those inmates that choose to do something with their time to cultivate relationship and care and love for themselves, for others, defy the system and become a threat to the system, in some ways. And I loved being a threat to the system in those situations and those very, very boundaried experience. But it was really the stripping of kind of the personal boundaries into the institution has been the problem. And I'll go back to just some really simple, basic teaching of the creation myth in the Christian tradition is born out of these waters, right? The waters come together in these four rivers in the Garden of Eden, just like the waters were separated from the waters in the first creation story in Genesis 1. And that flow is really what we're all longing to get back to, and in that flow is such a sense of letting go, right? Of being present to something greater than ourselves. And we build institutions on top of those things and forget about the flow. And a lot of what we do in this boundary work is break through the institution and get back to the flow. And the institution makes all these hierarchies happen around race, around gender, around sexuality, all those different things. When we get back into the flow, that's where we're simple and made in the image. And And so it's both honoring the institutional boundaries and knowing that where they're there, being very, very cognizant of that, and also getting into the water naked, you know, completely vulnerable and trusting in that holy space of possibility. And that's why I've talked a little bit about this invitation to the life and death cycle of things has really been a healing thing for my journey because it helps me remember that I'm not all that important. I will live and I will die, and I'm very, very simple in many ways. But I rely on others to hold that space and just create the possibility. Which is why I say yes to almost anything. When Trish emailed and said, "Hey, you want to be on a podcast?" I'm like, "Sure." You know, if I got space for something in some way, I want to make space for that. But this morning I was out walking and exercising and taking care of my body so I can do this, right? So you find your way to make that happen.
Yeah, this is such a tender topic, and and particularly for people like you and me, T. Michael, and actually Jayme is the same, which is we are people who are a big yes to life, to invitation, to stepping out in faith, to including the fear and doing it anyway. I mean, that's kind of the kind of people we are, right? Um, but that's in tension with the ability to set good, healthy boundaries around what choices we make and to realize that we have agency.
Mhm.
We can make choices. So before we started, I was mentioning that, in our we have many, many jurisdictions of these independent Catholic groups. And one of the things we're struggling with, and it's not just the independent Catholics who are struggling with this, it's going on in the Lutheran Church, the Episcopalian Church, it's probably going on in the UCC, if I was to chat with you, which is how do we equip people to be ministry leaders, particularly people with late vocations? So not everybody who comes into leadership has had the privilege of doing a 72 credit degree like Jayme did and I did, and very likely you did, right? And before I was in ordained for many, many years, I was a lay leader in ministry in various settings. And when I first met you, I was leading a ministry center at a large Roman Catholic church. And I had done no ministerial training whatsoever, zippo. And one of the issues that I dealt with in those 5 years, and looking back, I realized how acute it was, is that in the work we do, 90% of what goes on feels significant. That's one of the things that was different than working in the secular world, where I could say, okay, we're going to push that deadline back. We're going to do this with that project. We're going to hire this extra person to do this piece. When I was doing marketing communications and consulting, things might be significant, but they didn't have this valence that life and ministry had, where it really felt significant. Like, people would say, well, we really need you for this meeting from 7 to 9 on Thursday. And it was important to be there. And I kept going and going and going. I had not learned very well that no is a holy word. And that saying, I would love to help you with that. Or yes, I know that project's important to you, but I can't, I'm not able to say yes to that right now. Let me make a counteroffer or whatever, I could not do that. That was one of the things that I got equipped in seminary through the kinds of practical theology classes you teach, right? Whether that was, preaching or pastoral care or whatever. So this idea of setting boundaries and yes and no, for a lot of us, I think in our movement, we need to be partnered with each other and coach each other and support each other to know how to do that. Like, yes, a couple months ago, everyone said, yes, we need an Advent reconciliation service. Well, I could have circled back. I could have said, wow, look at these 3 weeks. We got a zillion things going on. We're very small. Are we still feeling like that's what we need? But I have this Roman Catholic tape that's playing somewhere deep in my brain that says, yes, you must do reconciliation in Advent and Lent. It's not even a law. I mean, yeah, you're supposed to do it in Lent, okay? But there's no rule saying I have to do it now, you know? So this whole thing around yes and no and boundaries and what I can do and what I can't do, and I have a family and I have other things, it's okay. I don't even know what the question is. I just know that this is for a lot of us, it's neuralgic,
Hmm.
getting tired and getting tired and getting tired. And
Yeah.
add in things like you're doing and I'm doing, where we're at the mosque witnessing the distress of the community, or we're at the school board
Yeah.
fighting for protections for whatever, or at Carmel Mall. Add that in, and it can get really heavy.
Very quickly. Very heavy.
A moment of silence.
Yeah.
I don't even know what that was. It was a site like a homilety. It was like a mini rant there, but it's just so. I am still developing
Yeah.
in this. I'm still developing. I'm still developing. What does it mean to be the priest?
Yeah.
Jayme has many decades on me being a priest. Jayme, what do you do? Like, how do you say have wonderful experience? Like, what is your program for knowing how to set these boundaries, being in the rhythm of it
Yeah.
all? I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, boundaries is really the key because I am a yes person, I'm like Mary saying yes to the Lord, if there's an opportunity to be able to serve someone in need, my initial reaction is yes, how can I make this so? But then I also have to balance it with so many other things in my personal and professional lives that it becomes a challenge to the people of God. But I think that fortunately the people of God are very understanding and often forgiving in that respect too. I mean, I'm recalling last week with our celebrations of Our Lady of Guadalupe. After my last mass of the day, the family invited me to stay for dinner, and I just thought to myself, as much as I would love to stay and build community with this family, I just need to find the most polite way of being able to say no in this moment, knowing that I need to take care of myself this evening. So it's a challenge. I don't pretend to have mastered it by any stretch of the imagination, but I think that that's one of the great challenges that all of us have in ministry, which is why I appreciate groups like this where we can come together with one another and be able to share our experiences and talk through it and see how it is that we can learn from one another and continue to grow, because that's what life is all about.
Yeah, and I think for us yes people that the question is not can I do this? Like that's what the question is I can. Of course you can. You can have one more thing in. The question is this a positive choice for you?
Yeah.
And are you choosing it freely after consideration, to borrow the language of a workshop that's been very important in my life? That this sense of obligation or expectation, or this is my role. I'm the priest, of course I should fill in the blank. Um, so asking ourselves, maybe learning to ask ourselves different questions. But I also want to get back, T. Michael, to what you're talking about appropriate processing and partnering.
Hmm.
So, like yesterday, when I got this very disappointing news, I needed to let my counsel know because they knew I was in the mix for this, and it has bearing on what we were about to do next, whether we'd have to hire some. So, but I wrote them a very simple note. I didn't write them, I'm totally crushed and I'm home and I'm sitting with Pete and I'm crying. No, I didn't. Now, my friend from my women's group called her up and I'm like, Darla, I'm so I to really know, where do I get support? How do I get support? Early on, I learned that I often said things to community members because they had been longtime friends that I shouldn't have been, that was not the right person to do that with. It burdened them.
Yeah.
So this whole idea, and at the same time, we need people,
Yeah.
right? We have to have those trusted people. Like I have a small faith community. I have a community of my meditation practice. I have my indivisible group. I have all these different circles that I can really get, loving support from. But, so what do you say to students? Like, what do you say to them as they're going out in terms of like, here are some ducks that you could potentially get, quacking in a row.
Uh, yeah, I mean, the development of like one's own emotional bodily intelligence. The work we are committed to in this world of um, really ministering in the midst of empire is a biblical,
Yeah.
relevant experience right now. And if we're not aware of our own intelligences and bodies and racial dynamics and all the different things that want to separate us, then we're in trouble of our own self-care. It's so I think it's often the lack of awareness of what's going on. I think one of the um, beautiful things from indigenous worlds is the call to be more awake.
Mhm.
Woke has got some kind of a bad connotation, but oh my God, that's a huge biblical thing. Be awake to what's happening
Mhm.
in the world. Be awake to the empire, be awake to the your own body systems, the aches and pains maybe of growing older, because we have those too. And how are we like processing that awareness is really what I talk to the students about a lot is
Mhm.
we and that's why spiritual direction and therapy and communities of practice are so important because it regulates us in a way to kind of be hyper aware of what's happening in the world and to feel, I lived in Providence, Rhode Island, just a few blocks from that building that was shot up on a couple days ago. And I heard the news that evening, and my body just went into hyperdrive, worrying about people that I love, I care about. I served that community for
Mhm.
9 years. I know that so well, and then watching yesterday all the news footage of people going store, street by street. I lived on that street,
Mhm.
that's my old house, the parsonage of the church that I served, and I know just the hyper awareness, and so my heart is breaking for that kind of thing. So knowing that I need to process that,
Mhm.
and then I'm no good with showing up for others if I'm a mess myself.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so it's just that very clear awareness of who we are. And I think what we do, hopefully in seminaries and why that seminary education is important is we're working on emotional, spiritual intelligences
Mhm.
and to process our bodies, to process what's happening in the midst of our own personal crises, the diagnosis we're going to get or our family's going to get that we've got to
Mhm.
process, on the way into leading a community, you know. The grief we're going to feel when someone close to us dies and we're officiating a funeral, the grief we're going to feel as, I'm a stage 4 cancer survivor and I walked the cancer journey with members of my congregation who were in the midst of dying and I was getting better. I've lived after that
Mhm.
and I'm cancer free now, but many folks who I was with didn't.
Mhm.
And their families were angry at me, projecting all kinds of lost hope in reality. I don't think God saved me rather than them. I think that, there's all kinds of different things that are happening there. And they had good, powerful, holy spiritual depth in their dying, each of them. And that's what we cultivated together along the way. And boy, I had to process a lot of grief along the way in my own, spent a lot of parking lot time, on the phone with important people and just in my own tears, just
Mhm.
um uh but it wasn't in the hospital room, it was in the parking lot.
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
knowing that you have to do your work too. And so it's developing the intentionality of those emotional and spiritual intelligences
Mhm.
that really do the work of anti-racism. It does the work of anti-white supremacy work. It does all that work, but we weren't meant to be divided by these different uh, religious labels, spiritual labels, sexual labels, whatever it is.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
um,
Yeah.
it's finding our way back to each other.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And, so we're coming near the close of our time, but, I'm just kind of struck by a few of the things you said that, maybe some of us could take a look at. So one is, do I make time to replenish myself and retreat? Like, do I step away? And I heard you say, do I put it on my calendar? And
Hmm.
do I have it communicated that way? So people, because that word does have a kind of sacred valence to it. So it's one thing for somebody to say, oh yeah, Reverend Rock's in a meeting, and it's another one to say, well, Reverend Rock's on retreat. You know, that says, oh, maybe I'm not going to text, or I'm not, if I've got the phone number or whatever.
Yep.
And then, having communities of practice. So one of the things that some of us face in our movement is we're alone. I'm the only ecumenical Catholic communion priest in the state of Minnesota. And Jayme is on his own in Texas. So we have to intentionally create circles of practice. So one of the things recently some of us did is we put together a call of all of the proto-diocese clergy of our denomination so that we can get together and just talk, just say what's going on and be real with each other and get to know each other. Even though, Mike's in Wisconsin and, Teresa's in Coeur d'Alene and, so we're all over the country, but making that time and also I heard you say making that time for prayer, meditation, small group, something outside the community that's really about filling up your own well.
Yeah.
Personally, for me, you mentioned us meeting, through centering prayer many years ago. Well, I have a meditation practice that I do every day, and I can't even imagine how I could be sustained without having time in silence,
Yeah.
which I can't believe is coming out of my mouth because I resisted meditation for decades because I thought I couldn't do it because my mind was too busy. And yet, for years now, it's become really central for me. Um, so I just want to kind of underline those for some of the folks who might be listening in who didn't have the privilege I had of being able to go up to St. John's and sit with Brother Zachary Wilberding in his office and, get this kind of wonderful
Yeah.
one-on-one coaching as well as wonderful classes. Um, Jayme, what do you think? You have any closing thoughts as we come to our end of our time together?
Happily. So I'm just really reflecting on how it is that we are entering this holiday season, a time of increased activity, a time of some real emotions, which range from the joy and mirth of the holiday season to some real dark emotions as well. This week, the church celebrated Saint John of the Cross, who was the mystic who made popular that phrase, the dark night of the soul. For many people, the holiday seasons is exactly that. It's reminding them of some of the dark valleys that they've gone through life. Some of them have lost loved ones since the last holiday season, or have had various other changes in life, as we see in the news at the national and state levels in so many places. And so for us, as what I'm struck by is this is not something that's just specific to clergy, but all people in life,
Mhm.
are approaching this holiday season with various feelings on our hearts, and it's probably important that all of us just take a moment, like Jesus in the wilderness, just to step back a bit from all of the activity and just to have to enjoy some time for ourselves where we can think about how it is that God is present and active in all of this, despite the craziness
Mhm.
sometimes.
Mhm.
Father Angelus Lafleur was an old priest in the seminary who was fond of saying, God writes straight with crooked lines. Sometimes all we see are the crooked lines, but we just have to trust that God is somehow working in all of this. And it's when we step back and take a deep breath, take a break from all of the action, spend a bit of time in contemplation, a bit of time by ourselves, that perhaps the curtain is pulled back a bit and we're able to see what it is that God has in store for each of us.
Mhm.
T-
So, T. Michael, I have a final question for you, which is like, what would you want to say to our clergy and our ministry lay leaders? Because those are the folks who would be dialing in terms of their worth, or their limits, or, or their faithfulness. I just was wondering if you had any words of encouragement for folks who just continue to suit up and show up, you know?
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to think and ruminate and recommit always. When we make the words come out of our mouth that they
Hmm.
imprint on our hearts. So any talk of self-care and honoring our own stories and our own need for community is just balm for the soul, right? And I do want to say that each of us are worth it to take that time, but our communities need us to be healthy.
Mhm.
I mean, our leadership does nothing if it is so stressed out and so taxed that we're not able to be present in that way. And so it's not only worth it for us individually, but it's our communities need us to be whole and healthy. And the thing that I would just like to kind of an invite to is that's been a big healing thing for me for years is to be outside, to be in nature. Too much of our lives are spent in books and in computer screens.
Mhm.
And so I tell my students I've never met a puddle I didn't want to splash in. I never like if the leaves are falling, they're for kicking. Like kick the leaves. It's so fun to like just play in the leaves and make a pile and jump in them. And here in Minnesota, I was shoveling and shoveling and shoveling the other day because we had 10 inches of snow. And so what you got to do at the end of that is to make a snow angel. You got to lay down in the snow and move your arms around and just be silly and play and dance. And when you're in the wilderness, you can dance with the trees and there's nobody there to judge you. There's nobody there to say you're not doing it the right way or you're singing off key or whatever. Just find those outlets for joy. And nature begs us to be joyful with it. There's so many experiences of these great mystics that call us into nature, that call us into the more than human world and say, you need some renewal here, and we will feed you, and your presence feeds us, and that reciprocity is going to make all of our leadership better, because it's not about us.
Mhm.
We're not
Yeah,
that important.
I think that's so great. What came to my mind as you were talking, that amazing poem by Wendell Berry called The Mad Farmer Liberation Front,
Oh yeah.
which is like one of my all-time favorites. And there's a line in there that says, be joyful, even though you've considered all the circumstances,
That's right.
you know? And, this is the tension, right? Is to like not put our heads in the sand, to care for ourselves so that when we come in on, when we come together, like I've really been thinking and praying for like the last few years about like, what do people find here when they walk in the door on Sunday? And do they find the love and joy and peace of Christ? And that's the thing that like, if we can focus on that people feel loved when they come here, that they feel like, oh, I can breathe a little deeper because I'm a little more peaceful, or these goofy people are laughing. We laugh a lot in this community, oh, wow, yeah, we had someone grabbed on Mitchell Road, but we're still, and went out and we blew whistles and we witnessed, but now we're coming back together and we're remembering that there's something greater afoot in all of this. As a young seminarian once said when she preached for our community, God is always doing God's thing. And do I trust that? And can I be joyful? Jayme, you want to wrap us up?
Happily. Thank you, T. Michael Rock. So greatly appreciate your being with us today. T. Michael Rock of Lyndale United Church of Christ and the United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. We also want to thank our listeners. Thank you for joining us for Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. I'm Father Jayme Matthias.
And I am Reverend Trish Sullivan Vani.
Happy holidays.
And stay joyful
Yeah.
despite the evidence.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you for joining us for Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. Keep the faith.